The Grim Tale of Grace Macabre. Chapter 14. Grace was running for her life. She ran as if Satan himself were chasing her. Her heart slammed against her rib cage. She was disoriented, terrified. She ran down a dark hallway, trying to understand where she was and how she had gotten there. A few moments ago, she had woken up on the floor, and as she had gotten to her feet, a group of kids rounded the corner in the gloom behind her. She called out for their help, but realized that something was wrong with them. They were hunched over and loped toward her, arms flailing about as if some evil puppet master pulled their strings. Suddenly, one of them lurched forward and grabbed her arm. His face was pale, like the underbelly of a snake. There were dark veins squirming just under the skin. His ink-black eyes were open but devoid of life. His hand was cold, and when Grace looked down at it, she realized it was swollen and mottled gray and black, like the hand of a man who was 10 days dead. The others pressed closer, and through the murky light, she was able to see their faces. All were slack-jawed, black-eyed dead things. She screamed, tore her arm from the thing's grasp, and ran. The group of dead kids loped after her. But no matter how hard she ran or how slowly they scampered, she could not gain any ground on them. They stayed just a few feet away, nearly close enough to snatch her shirt and pull her down, yet far enough away that she couldn't clearly see their death-masked faces in the darkness. "Grace," they croaked. "Grace." She rounded a corner, through an open door into a huge room. It took her a heartbeat to realize where she was. She was at school, and she had just run into the lunchroom. The only light was gray and misty, coming from an unknown source. It cast everything in long, twisting shadows. Ian lay on the floor, covered in blood. Justin Jones stood on a table, a smoking gun in his right hand, his journal in the left. He, too, was dead. An ink pen protruded from his chest, and his shirt was smeared in black blood. All the other students were sitting in their chairs at various lunch tables, as if they were in a trance. They sat slack-jawed with their blank stares fixed on Justin. "Help me!" she screamed, glancing over her shoulder at the grunting horde running up behind her. She now understood that she must be in a nightmare, but didn't care. It felt real. She could still feel the icy dampness on her arm where the dead thing had grabbed her. She grasped the door, feeling its steel weight on her fingertips, and slammed it shut just in time, locking the horde out of the lunchroom. The dead thing smashed into the door, and she felt it shudder against the onslaught. "Help me!" she screamed again. She tried telling herself that this was a dream, but she had never had a dream where she could feel the things she touched, or the clammy cold when dead things touched her. She could even feel her hot tears as they streamed down her face. If this was a dream, it was the most vivid, terrifying one she had ever experienced. She also knew that by shutting herself in the lunchroom, she was only trading one horror for another. The dead horde, or the slack-jawed students awaiting death at the hand of whatever Justin had become. She looked through the small glass set in the door and stared into the face of the thing that had grabbed her arm. The dark veins in its cheeks and forehead were moving, squirming, as if alive. With revulsion, she realized that they must not be veins. Then it opened its mouth, impossibly wide, and a large oil-black snake struck out at her against the other side of the window, causing her to scream. "Grace," the thing moaned. The other dead kids pressed up against it, trying to throw their weight against the door. They cried out in unison, "Grace." She turned away and ran toward the students sitting in the room, yelling at them to wake up, to help her. None of them moved. They only sat and stared at Justin, who wheeled around and fixed a hate-filled stare on her. "Shut up!" he yelled. His voice was thick, as if filled with mucus. "I can't stand your pitiful yelling, you stupid girl." Grace stared at him. His face was the same shade of snake-belly white as the face of the things in the hall. There were thin, writhing lines just under his skin, too. His eyeliner had smeared and run down his cheeks. It pooled in the cleft of his chin. She realized that his eyes seemed to be changing color. They were gray, but darkening to black. "Finally," he said, after she had stopped yelling and focused her stare on him. "Now that you've made it to the show, maybe we can get started." Grace didn't know how to respond to Justin's statement. She didn't know if she should. Justin waved the gun in the air as he spoke. His dyed black hair hung down over his left eye. "You see those things in the hall?" Grace nodded. She glanced over her shoulder and saw the things fighting with each other just to get a glimpse through the small window in the door. "That's what we all become sooner or later, Grace." Justin scowled. "That's what we're all destined to be. Just mindless things that consume whatever we can grab. We bully those who are weak and steal from others in need. We all become a burden to each other as we destroy this planet." Grace didn't understand. She dared to shake her head. "You don't see it, Grace? You of all people should know the truth. You're smarter than most of us here in this backwater school, in this bizarre little town. I see you watching these miserable wretches. I know you get it." "Get what?" Grace said. Her voice was tiny, weak, distant. Justin threw up his hands, the gun pointing to the ceiling. Pages tumbled from the journal to the floor. "Get what?" he mimicked. He lowered the gun, pointed it at Brandon Decker, and pulled the trigger. Instead of crying out in pain when the bullet slammed into his chest, Brandon smiled. He slumped down over the table, then slowly slid off into the floor. "No!" Grace screamed. Justin gave a knowing smirk, his Stygian eyes narrowing to dark slits. Gray smoke slithered from the barrel of the gun and curled around his head. "Just watch," he whispered. "Just watch, And you will see, Grace. You will understand what you already know. Grace didn't know what Justin meant. She stared at him, noting that his right eye was growing darker by the moment. It still reflected some of the ethereal light in the room, but Grace doubted it would for much longer. There was movement on the floor where Brandon had fallen. Turning, she saw that Brandon was starting to pull himself up from the floor. He had completely transformed into one of the dead things. His skin was now mottled gray with black writhing veins, and his eyes had turned completely black. "Now do you get it, Grace?" Justin asked, his voice booming. "Do you get it? He's turning into one of those all-consuming, mindless things in the hall." He crouched down on the table, never taking his eyes off the Brandon thing. Then, in a raspy whisper, "I just helped him become one more quickly." She could only stare at the Brandon thing. It pulled itself up onto its knees. It reached out with a death-mottled hand and grabbed one of the girls by the hair sitting in the next chair. It leaned in close and sniffed her face. The girl smiled. Grace turned away, her stomach churning. She saw Ian lying on the floor and moved toward him, but Justin yelled at her to stop. Turning back to face Justin, she saw that he was crying. "I was supposed to help them all become what they really are, Grace. I was supposed to help them change into the all-consuming beasts that they really are. I was supposed to expose their true faces to the stupid people in this town, but he stopped me." Justin pointed at Ian. Then, cat quick, he turned and shot the girl that the Brandon thing was sniffing. Grace screamed. There was a brief look of pure rapture on the girl's face before she slumped back into her chair. "That stupid goody two-shoes Ian stopped me." Justin shot 3 more kids. Each of them smiled upon their deaths. Grace could no longer scream. She was cold and numb, not only on the outside, but completely down to her soul. The kids who had been shot were beginning to twitch and squirm back to life. They were becoming. "I was supposed to show their true faces to the world," Justin said, black tears streaming down his face. "But he stopped me, Grace. He doesn't see what we see. He doesn't see that these people need to be exposed for their meanness. He doesn't see them as being a drain on the earth. He sees them as things able and worthy of redemption. He doesn't think they need to die. But you do. Don't you, Grace?" Grace knew these kids were self-involved and mean, each of them in their own way. The Barbie zombies were vicious to the less fortunate and less beautiful girls. The jocks punched, slapped, and kicked the weaker boys in school. None of them respected individuality. All of them wanted to be the same. Even though she saw these kids as horrible people, she had never wished any of them dead. She looked down at Ian and noticed something amazing. He had been shot by Justin, just like the other kids. But while they were becoming something dark and twisted, Ian lay on the floor with a look of peace on his face. He was pale, but not the bloated dead pale of the undead things. In fact, there was a sort of glow around him, faint, yet unmistakable. She knelt over him, taking it in, knowing that there was something important she was supposed to take from this scene, but understanding eluded her. She reached out to touch him and was overcome with a sense of something unimaginably powerful about to wash over her. As her hand hovered over Ian's body, she felt as if she were on the shore of some vast ocean, watching as an immense tidal wave towered over her, ready to drench her in profound knowledge. There was no fear of this tidal wave. In fact, she willed it to come more quickly, was afraid that it would somehow recede, leaving her empty. Closing her eyes, she silently begged the wave to wash over her. What does this all mean? What am I supposed to understand? No! Justin screamed behind her. Do not touch him! Grace could hear the moaning of the dead kids who had become. The dead things in the hall began pounding on the door in a frantic rage. She felt an icy presence run up behind her, and she knew it was Justin, bearing down on her. He was going to stop her from touching Ian. Without looking back, she opened her eyes and reached down to touch Ian's hands, which were clutching at the seeping wound in his chest. She saw that the bright blue patch with the Greek word oikos had grown dark with blood. Just as her hand brushed his, she was grabbed from behind and thrown down to the floor. She grasped at his sweatshirt but lost her grip when it ripped. Immediately, when Justin and the dead things grabbed her, the tidal wave of potential knowledge receded. Grace screamed, her heart crying out at the loss of understanding. She screamed at the emptiness inside her. She screamed as thick, clammy hands tore at her. "Grace!" someone yelled, shaking her. "Grace! Wake up, honey! Wake up!" Grace's eyes snapped open, and she looked into the eyes of her mother. "Honey, it's just an awful nightmare. It's okay." Jennifer hugged Grace tight, smoothing her hair and whispering in her ear. Grace clung to her mother and sobbed. She could still smell the acrid scent of gunpowder. She could feel the cold hands of the undead things clawing at her body. After a long moment, those things receded and her crying subsided. That's when she noticed something clasped tightly in her hand. She held up her fist, careful that her mother couldn't see, and opened her hand. In it was the blood-stained patch she had ripped from Ian's jacket. The Grim Tale of Grace Macabre, Chapter 15. Jeremy McCree was 9 years old. He had seen the crawling man for the first time 2 nights ago, though it was only a glimpse. He'd gotten up to get a drink of water from the bathroom and caught sight of a man with abnormally long legs and arms crawling at the end of the hallway. Jeremy had been groggy and wasn't even sure he'd really seen anything. However, whether it was real or not, it had scared him. He had run into his mom's bedroom, jumped onto her bed, and scooted under the covers, taking comfort that the blankets were surely a shield against monsters. Besides, his mom was a brave woman. He had seen her fight off a scary, bloody-faced clown at Mr. Odd's grocery store a few months ago. It was dark because it was late, and some of the lights in the parking lot were not working, and the terrifying clown came at them from behind a dumpster as they walked to their car. She had kicked and punched the evil clown when he pulled a large knife on them and demanded that she give them all their money. She had not seemed scared at all, though a little shaky afterward. His mom was a hero. She would protect him not only from scary clowns, but from that creepy, crawling man. Over the past 2 days, Jeremy had convinced himself that what he had seen was a combination of shadows and an overactive imagination. He now lay unafraid in his bed, reading a book. It was dark except for the soft glow of the book light. It was after 9 p.m., and Mom was already asleep because she had worked a lot of hours this week and was especially tired. After a while, he realized he had to use the bathroom and slipped from under his blanket and stepped out into the hallway. Mom kept the house dark at bedtime, with only a tiny light on in the kitchen, which cast a feeble glow down the hallway. The bathroom was easy enough to find in the dark house because it lay halfway down the hall and to the left. Jeremy was looking down at the floor as he exited his bedroom, but as he turned down the hall, he looked up. That is when he saw the crawling man again. At first, he didn't understand what he was seeing. The feeble yellow glow from the kitchen nightlight backlit him as he slowly crawled toward Jeremy. A beam of moonlight poured in from the window in the bathroom and pooled on the floor about halfway between him and the crawling man. It almost, but not quite, illuminated his face as he pulled himself closer. The crawling man crept very slowly, purposefully toward Jeremy. He was big and slow and extremely misshapen. It was spidery in how he used his appendages to crawl, yet serpentine in how his head slowly moved back and forth, side to side, as if trying to use hypnosis. Jeremy stood frozen in place as the crawling thing crept closer to the pool of moonlight. Jeremy wanted to cry out to his mom. She was asleep in her room just across the hall, but he found he had no voice. It was as if the serpentine movement of the crawling man's head had indeed hypnotized him to believe that he could not utter a sound. In fact, not only could Jeremy not even create a whimper, but he also found that he had no control over any part of his body. Jeremy could only stand in silent, wide-eyed witness to this monster's slow creep. Jeremy's heart pounded so hard his head ached. He was so cold that he was shaking. The shaking was in great part due to the terror that was slithering its way through his mind, but it was also so supernaturally cold in the hallway that his teeth were rattling together. They sounded like deathly wind chimes made of human bone. After an agonizing, long moment, the crawling man finally made his way fully into the moonlight and stopped. Jeremy was able to see every horrifying detail. The elbow and knee joints were gnarled and arthritically twisted. His legs reminded Jeremy of the legs of a giant locust in the way that they were misshapen. His torso was elongated and pale, calling to mind a sickening hybrid of human cadaver and praying mantis. His head was oblong and covered in fine, stringy hair. He paused in the moonlight, compelling Jeremy to witness to his horrific form. Jeremy noticed movement behind the monster. From out of the dark shadows stepped 2 boys about his age. They stopped in the pale moonlight, one on each side of the monster. Jeremy could see their eyes were completely black and that their smiles seemed too wide and too full of teeth. They raised their hands toward him, as if beckoning him. In unison, they began to whisper. "Join us," they murmured in sinister harmony. "Join us. Let him take you." Jeremy glanced at the monster. He saw the orifice that served as the crawling man's mouth was silently moving. The crawling man tilted his head, allowing the moonlight to illuminate his face, and Jeremy could see that he was also whispering. Jeremy could not hear what he was saying, but he could clearly see it was the same thing over and over, as if he were reading the monster's misshapen lips. It was a lethal question that also served as a dark threat. "Do I eat you now, or eat you later?" Hello, I am Lafayette Faust, the creator of this strange little podcast. I'm very grateful for all of you who have become constant listeners. You've given me a platform to pursue my passion, which is writing stories that hopefully entertain and engage, and if I'm doing it right, give you the occasional shiver. This podcast is free, but it isn't free to produce. If you are a fan of the show, I invite you to go by the store and buy a t-shirt or a mug. The link is in the show notes. But, of course, the most important thing you can do is subscribe to us on your favorite platform. Then, please like, share, and rate the show. Any support will be immensely appreciated.